I'd now just like to pass you across to my colleague Gary Cameron, who will now open today's session with his presentation, and I think he's just about to start it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'll just add my welcome to the one that George delivered. Thank you, George. Just before, the power of feedback then. All the experts tell us, all the theorists, all the researchers tell us that one of the most important learning tools is the power of feedback. And when I was thinking about putting the presentation together, I wanted to know, well, where did the word feedback come from? And originally it was used as part of electronics and some kind of engineering technical term. And it was something that feeds back into a machine or a system. And actually sometimes you can have negative feedback as well as positive feedback. But in the educational sense, we're talking about positive feedback. And I truly believe that we can have all the best technology in the world, all the best classrooms, the best resources. Best resource is still very much the lecturer, the trainer or the teacher, and the quality of feedback that they give. So let's get started then after that short introduction. Where we're going today with the webinar, I'm going to go over the features and basic elements of constructive and developmental feedback, because that's what feedback should be. If we're going to move anybody's learning forward, it should be constructive and developmental, and I'll talk about what that means. And I suppose the most important thing for me is the impact of feedback on people's learning. I'll be as bold to agree with Dylan William, who is, I suppose, a recognised guru in the research world of feedback and the part that plays in formative assessment. And he says the only thing that matters about feedback is what learners, students, you and I do with that feedback. So that's where we're going today. As George said, it will take me about 25 minutes and then we will have some questions. But first of all, I'd like some feedback from yourself, so I'm just going to ask you to type away in the chat box when I put the next slide up, and I'll contribute as well. So the question is, let me get some feedback from you. What's the most positive work-related experience or result achieved today? So just take a moment to think and then put your comments in the chat box. Thank you. Thanks, George. This webinar, that's good to hear. Oh, fantastic, Susan. That's always a bonus when somebody agrees to do something. Fantastic. My one is George getting me ready for this webinar. He's really good. We just turn up and sit down in our webinar room and it's all done. It's very satisfying. Claire, you've had a busy afternoon. Second marking, working on my CPD. Fantastic, Mark. That's great. Thanks very much for doing that. Just a wee bit of feedback and a bit of engagement from yourselves as part of the webinar. Okay, let's move on then. Those of you who work in the sector, you'll know about our standards for college lecturers, our professional standards that we work to. I got this document up last week and I just put a search in for the word feedback and it mentions the word feedback 30 times, so there's definitely something going on with feedback, certainly in relation to our standards. And those of you who are perhaps very experienced teaching staff, or even new and beginning teaching staff, you'll come across this word feedback time and time again. But certainly an important part of our standards, which suggests that the conceptual model and the whole research-based techniques of feedback is quite well established now. Again, I would probably be really bold to say that there are very few bits of educational research that have high impact. There are two main ones for me that really do I suppose, our true action research, I suppose one which is less relevant for our sector, but is that the teaching of early reading and phonological awareness and how we teach phonics to get youngsters reading. But the other big one is assessment is for learning, which, that's the buzzy word, but we just talk about feedback. But certainly the research that has gone into this whole concept of feedback really has had an impact on education in schools and colleges and higher education as well. One thing I do like to talk about is that feedback should really be like a good murder. What do I mean by that is mainly because it's feedback, the use of feedback really helps us address two of our main teaching approaches, and one of those teaching approaches is eliciting student performance. And again, that's just big education words for feedback. That's what we do when we're giving and receiving feedback. And we do, if you tuned in for some of the earlier webinars, we focused on asking questions and how important that was in getting feedback from our students. We also give feedback on the learning aims, the success criteria, and we also engineer good discussions which enable us to get good discussion going, as well as the feedback. And the other thing is we facilitate learning by the use of our feedback, and facilitating learning is two of the 5 main teaching approaches that I talk about. But yes, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, feedback, you need the motive. You have to do something with it, so there has to be a motive to do something with it. What's the motive for our learners? Well, obviously to get better, to move the learning forward, to have more success. We need opportunity to do it, and part of the feedback strategies that we have is we say, well, here's the action points we'd like you to do, and the opportunities are come and speak to me, talk to our peers as part of peer contribution to the learning, and it also has to be timed. There has to be a good time on it, because students tell us time and time again, as does the research, feedback has to be timely. If there's too long a gap between giving feedback, then students will not act on it as well as they might do. So, it's a bit of fun, but feedback should be like a good murder: motive, opportunity, and time to do something with it. So what are the basic elements of formative assessment? And feedback is certainly one of those. And again, there'll be no surprises here to some of the stuff that you're reading on the slide there. But the basic elements of formative assessment are sharing the learning intentions, and that's a skill in itself. Effective questioning, self and peer evaluation, and effective feedback. But I've kind of summarised all that by saying that actually it's about the quality of the interaction with the lecturer, each other, that's the student, lecturer, and of course the resources that we have. How lecturers and teachers engineer good discussions and good interaction and good collaborative learning, then the whole concept of feedback emerges naturally and intuitively. So these are the basic elements of formative assessment, and if you say, what does formative assessment mean to practitioners in all life areas of education, the word feedback is definitely there. So moving on. The only thing that matters about feedback is one that I said earlier, that we have to do something with it. But for students, it should be more work for the student than the lecturer. And what the students do with the feedback shouldn't be more work for me. If I give the action points, and I give the opportunity, and I give the motive, and I give good time and good signposting to resources, it should make the learners or the students work smarter, if not harder. So for me, it's about making the students work harder to bring about that improvement of their learning. And how students react to the feedback will depend on the quality of the working relationships that you have developed with them. As you know, some students are very receptive to feedback, others less so, and that really does come down to the positive professional and caring relationships that we build up with our students in all areas and all sectors of education. So, feedback then. I would suggest it moves learning and practice forward if the quality of feedback is high. we can't get away from feedback. It's just everywhere in education, and I've just put a wee statement in there saying there's no escape, and that the skill of giving feedback is just as important as responding to it. I think lecturers and teachers and trainers have to be really pretty skilled operators in giving feedback, and we'll talk about some of the tips and techniques in a moment or two, and definitely should make them work harder. So just to pick up on a few things about effective feedback, in the link at the end where I've given you a very short piece of reading and it's only pages 13 to 19, don't read the whole document. If you've got time to skim over the link at the end, the document there. This document talks about 7 principles of good feedback. And they're quite straightforward. Again, there are no surprises. What are those 7 principles of effective feedback then? Feedback is effective when it encourages students to self-assess and reflect on their learning, critically evaluate their learning, and think about how they could move it forward. Feedback, another principle, second principle, is you should have a good conversation around the learning, should be good dialogue around the learning, and that definitely is part of the learning and teaching process as you live and breathe it with your learners. It should always lead to an improvement in learning. That's another principle, basic principle of feedback. It should also give quality information to the students. Good high quality feedback. Another principle is that it develops a more positive motivation and self-esteem. And I just wanted to pick up on that whole issue. We hear a lot about motivation and self-esteem and how important feedback is for that. But Dylan William, who researches a lot on the power of feedback, talks about feedback in 2 ways when he's talking about motivation. He says that some feedback is ego involving. And what he means by that is when we tell people that the work's really good and they've done really well and it's fantastic, and it kind of builds up our self-esteem. But he questions whether or not that type of ego-involving feedback actually does move the learning forward. Dylan Williams suggests that the better type of feedback to improve motivation and self-esteem is task-involving feedback, where you focus on the task, you give them action points, and you have the dialogue around the task. And I quite like Dylan Williams' theory there, because not all praise feedback is good or has an impact on the learning of students. I think it's better if it's task involving and the feedback really does focus on the tasks that you're working on with the students. Right, I've said a lot there about feedback, and I'm just going to mute my microphone for a minute, and in usual Gary style, just in the chat box, having listened to me for about 12 minutes there, what are you thinking? So I'm just going to mute my microphone for a minute. What are you thinking about this concept of feedback after my short input there? Yes, thanks for that, Mark. That's a really interesting comment about if you provide the positive feedback first, then that probably leads to disengagement. Yep, and we'll talk about some tips and techniques in a moment or two that spread across the 7 basic principles of effective feedback. Yep. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, I like to think that my own skills of giving feedback are developing all the time. I work quite closely in one college with lecturers who are doing their professional development award in learning and teaching qualification for their education, and a large part of my job is giving developmental and incremental feedback, and it is a real skill. It's a huge skill to develop our colleagues' confidence and self-esteem and motivation. Okay, Claire's still typing there, so we'll wait to see what Claire says and then we'll move on. That's great, Claire. Yeah, the ego involving. Yes. No, that was fine, Claire. Thank you. It's all really good feedback for me because I can say, I'm doing another webinar series called Formative Assessment in Action, which is taking place in January. So your comment there has given me feedback that I need to focus a wee bit more on the use of praise and ego involving feedback. So that's great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Okay, thanks for doing that. So moving on then, if learners are to respond to feedback, it has to be information specific, it has to be issue focused, it has to be developmental, and it has to be timely. Now that's a wee bit of a mouthful there, but I have an acronym which I've developed, and the acronym is PACT. All our feedback that we give, just think about the kind of scaffold of the acronym PACT, and P stands for pertinent. So anything that we give feedback has to be absolutely pertinent and relevant, I suppose. That's probably a better word, but people don't really know the acronym RACT. I think PACT is better. A stands for action. It has to be action focused. There has to be things that they have to do. There has to be an action based on the feedback. C, it is concise, and it's exactly the point that Mark was making in his comment there. If it's not concise, they'll not get the signal for the noise, and if it's long-winded and there are too many action points, I don't think that helps build up my motivation and self-esteem, or motivate me to go on and do the action. And lastly, as I said earlier, it has to be timely. So any feedback, the acronym PACT helps me. So any feedback has to be pertinent, it has to be action focused, has to be concise, and it has to be timely. But if we're going to develop our reflective thinking and our evaluation with our students, not only does it have to be supportive through the PACT acronym, but it also has to be challenging, because all learning should challenge our thinking. So, thinking of myself, I asked my question, well, how would I respond best to feedback? And I think it just kind of summarises some of the things I've been saying this afternoon. It focuses on the learning, it's clear and specific, I always focus on my students, it encourages the reflection, and it provides suggestions for development. And the development I want is not more work for me, but smarter work from the students, and for them to take a bit of responsibility for their own learning. I've put this slide up, and there's a new kind of concept emerged in the whole language of feedback and formative assessment, and this is feedback, feed up and feed forward. I don't think that's particularly helpful, I have to say, but I thought I would just mention it. You might hear people talking about feed up and feed forward. I suppose if we were trying to explain it, when we're giving feedback, we are talking about something that's happened in the past. Maybe it's a bit reactive, but I mean that's how we have to work with assessment, particularly with summative assessment. But if we use, if we give feedback on summative assessment, that's fantastic as well, because what that means is we're actually using formative assessment summatively. So we're giving feedback on the summative assessment. The feed up, feed forward, it has its benefits in that it's forward thinking and it's a bit more proactive, and it really is giving, putting that responsibility back onto the students for their learning. I think it does give personal responsibility and accountability, but it's just in case you come across those words. I stick with the word feedback. I think that does what it says on the tin, and feedback is one of the 4 basic elements of formative assessment. But you might come across that word. And again, on the left-hand side there, I've put feedback. It focuses on the strengths and the development needs and develops that reflective thinking. But feed up, feed forward, I'll leave you to consider, is it a useful definition. So before I go into some tips and techniques about what the research tells us about the 7 principles of good feedback and some of the things you might want to try, again, just to give you a break from my voice, you will have your own good techniques for giving feedback. So I think just for a minute or two, just think about the feedback you give to your students. What sort of things do? You don't have to contribute, but just put it in the box. What sort of things do you do? And you'll see my little graphic on the right hand side there, but it's you're doing great. I suppose that is ego involving feedback. Right? I'm just stroking people's ego by saying, yeah, you're fantastic. It's not task involving. So I thought I chose that one because it's just a nice example of how we can be ego involving. Yeah, one-to-one conversations. Yeah. Thanks, Carly. Yeah. Celebrating success, I would call that, your level 5 students. Yeah, feedback sandwich, yeah, that's where you have, yeah, I've heard that analogy. If you're parents yourself, particularly of primary aged young school children, you'll hear about 2 stars and a wish, which I suppose fits quite nicely with the PACT acronym, that it's short and it's concise and it's timely as well. Yeah, thank you, Claire. Give some praise, then a suggestion. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. No, there's no such thing as rubbish feedback. All feedback, I mean, everything we tell students about their work is feedback. Might not be that action-focused feedback all the time, but feedback is feedback. I mean, I'm quite old, and in the bad old days when you were marking reports and essays where they were doing theory, it was quite simply 9 out of 10. That's feedback. But I think we've moved on from these bad old days when, we just, in our sector, we just would not get away with that anymore, and quite rightly so. Okay, we've got 4 or 5 minutes to go, but I thought I'd like to finish it off by just talking about some tips and techniques. I mentioned at the beginning the 7 principles of good feedback practice. I thought I would just revisit them and give 1 or 2 things that the experts tell us and that I've used and I've certainly found quite useful in feedback. First principle I spoke about earlier in the webinar was students thinking about their learning, and I suppose the most obvious way of doing that, and our colleagues do that all the time in all areas of education, and that's the use of self and peer assessment. And certainly Curriculum for Excellence has given a real boost to that whole concept of self and peer assessment. My advice for what it's worth would be, we need to teach the skills of self-assessment before we go anywhere near peer assessment, because that is quite a skilled operation. But certainly self and peer assessment is something that I think all curriculum areas, particularly in the college sector, are involved in. One thing I have tried with my students is, to get them to think about their learning is I've sometimes asked them, what kind of feedback do you find the most useful? And what would you like to see in your feedback? And that's quite fascinating. You get some mature thoughts around that. Another thing I like to do is talk about the strengths and developments of their own work before they're giving it to the lecturer. So even before they hand it in to me and I have a look at it, I say, what do you think are the strengths and what do you think are development needs of your work? And again, that just gets a conversation around it. And they look at me as if I'm mad, and I've had a few comments back like, Gary, that's your job, get on with it. But actually, it's about developing that conversation around the learning. The second principle is about that whole dialogue, that whole learning conversation. And we know that we look at comments that move the learning forward, but I sometimes ask my students the feedback comments that I've given them and ask them to explain how they've helped, and if they have helped, what are they going to do about to improve that particular task or that particular piece of work. And I've again, one of you in the chat box said, you do have these one-to-one chats. I ask those kind of conversational questions that get them to speak about their learning. Another principle is where you clarify the standard you're looking for, or the good performance that you're looking for. One thing that I have done in the past, my background is social science, so when I teach psychology and sociology, I actually have written assignments for them and just said, here's one that's been done in the past. What do you think of this? Do you think it's met the success criteria? Is it answering the question? What do you think of that? And that is really fascinating. I've had some really tough feedback on some of the stuff that I have produced. But my big question to the learners has it met the criteria? And one exercise I did was I created a poorly constructed sociology answer. It was kind of an extended question answer. It was poorly constructed, but it actually had all the right information in it. And then I created one which was beautifully written, absolutely fantastic language. I was quite proud of myself, but actually it conveyed nothing. It was just absolutely beautifully written rubbish. And when we had this learning conversation about it, it was absolutely fascinating what the students come up with. We don't have time to do that nowadays, but sometimes I do give them an example and say, would this meet the criteria? Is it related to the learning intentions? Is it related to the learning outcomes? Another one they talk about is closing the gap, and the use of feedback in closing the gap. That's just big nonsense words for we want them to get better, we want them to get to the next stage. And for me, closing the gap is just feedback for improvement. And it's developing the student responses, and it's that task involving bit. So when I read that stuff, I just thought, that's gobbledygook. How do we explain that? Closing the gap for me is just about giving good feedback that moves the student on, that develops the improvement, and is task involving. And high quality stuff as well, prioritising the areas for improvement. Somebody talked about the feedback sandwich there. I like 2 stars and a wish. That's concise enough for me, because some of the work I'm dealing with, I would destroy self-esteem and motivation if I just gave a long list of action points there. So I like this 2 stars and a wish, but also the feedback sandwich is good that one of you mentioned there. Another principle of good feedback, one other thing you can do is you only give the students the mark, whether it's a pass or a fail, or if it's a grade, after they've responded to your feedback comments. So you give them a piece of work back, you ask them to engage with the feedback, and then you have that conversation based on your feedback. Does that meet the success criteria? Has it met the mark? Is it a pass or a fail? What grade do you think that should be if you're grading stuff? I like that one because they have to engage with the feedback, they have to read through it, and they really have to think about it, which again develops their reflection. Another thing I like about the feedback principles are the next steps. For me, it's part of my evaluation. It gives me evaluation. I got some nice comments in the chat box there. It's good feedback for me, because when I do my next webinar series, Formative Assessment in Action, which unpacks formative assessment more than just the feedback bit of it, but it's good evaluation strategies for me. Helps me shape up my next steps for learning and teaching. And one thing I do like when I'm given feedback as part of the learning and teaching process, I like to use what I call 1-minute papers. And quite often I'll drop into my teaching and I'll say to my group of students, what's the most important thing I've just said in this whole session I've spent with you? Or pick out 2 of the most important things that Gary has taught you this afternoon. And I also like to ask them, what questions have you still got? What's outstanding? What are the questions you still need to know? So I like my 1-minute and 2-minute papers. If you read that document about the 7 principles of effective feedback, I think there's something like 42 ways of giving feedback. We don't have time to do that. I've just picked out more than 1 or 2, about 6 or 7 that I really like, that I use when I'm given developmental and incremental feedback. But if you've missed a wee bit in all my ramblings and what I like to use, as George said at the beginning, the link will put the meat on the bones if you like. Okay, we're just about there. Usually I'm bang on time, but I'm 4 minutes late, which is not good. But moving on. Um, yeah, I think I've dealt with my final comments. We have to be a skilled operator. Task focusing. The lecturer, the more knowledgeable person, the teacher is the best resource. And feedback and feed forward is the best tool in the box for reflection and improvement. When my curriculum manager used to observe me, or I was observed by Education Scotland, they would say things like, how do you get them to think about their learning? How do you get them to self-evaluate, self-assess? Dead easy. It's the feedback that I give them and the questions that I ask them, get them to reflect on their tasks and their learning. Really good questioning techniques, but using their tasks and the assessment instruments with some of the techniques that I've gone through this afternoon. So, just before we sign off, in the chat box, identify one thing. You've probably got loads of things, but that's part of being evaluative. Can you identify one thing you found interesting in the Power of Feedback webinar content this afternoon? Thanks, Mark. And there's much more information in the link that George has highlighted. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, just some stuff I use. You might like them, you might hate them, and it depends very much on your curriculum area. But certainly in theory sessions, I think some of the ones that I've highlighted, I do think get students engaged, get them thinking, get them evaluating, and taking some responsibility. PACT, yeah, yeah, acronyms are good, aren't they? Not at all, Claire. I've heard a lot worse from my students, believe me. So just while people are putting the last bits in the box there, just thank you very much for listening. Thank you for participating, and what we've done this afternoon is get you to provide feedback. Thank you, Carly. I've really enjoyed being with you. And if you've got any questions, I'll hang around for a couple of minutes. If not, I would suggest if you get a moment, just go back over my presentation and have a look at the link as well.